Hot take. What's the question, Kyle?
I guess the question is, what is the future of the comic book industry in light of emerging technology?
Welcome to the Deep Chat.
There's VR, which I would categorize in the game world, right?
It doesn't have to be, but I see where you're going, so yeah.
Okay, and then there is automation in terms of AI generating stories and scripts and drawings.
Right.
Because those are the two that come to my mind.
Well, yeah, so in some sense, it's will the medium go away because other media has come to be? And that's a weirder, more sociological question, and my answer is no. It may shrink even further in market size or something, but sequential art in this format is not something that will disappear per se because some other technology showed up.
My hot take answer would be no.
Yeah.
I don't think the comic book industry will go away, but will it diminish? That's a tough one. I'd like to know.
It's kind of been doing that anyways. I know a little bit about this. Yeah. So, okay, there's a lot of drama in this, and I know bits of it. But comics, if you go back to the 50s, were huge. And even after that, there was a strong kind of component of it. Like, they would sell millions of issues of any one comic, whereas today, like 100,000 is like record-breaking. There was also some tie-in with troops and war and overseas stuff, where a lot of service people engaged in comic book fandom or whatever. And that has since gone away, which was a piece of that market. Beyond that, like the more modern incarnation is this Wednesday release schedule where everything went through one distributor, Diamond, up until COVID, and the two major companies have now been bought by large media franchises. So it's this industry that's in a weird quasi-almost bankrupt state, but now owned by giant companies to mine the IP and generally like run by underpaid people who love what they're doing.
I think that was all a lot.
Yeah.
And I followed it, and I think you're 100% right, especially in that last part about mining it for IP. Disney did not buy Marvel for any other reason than the IP.
Yeah, and look what they've done with it. Incredible things.
Well, but to Marvel's credit, they did it before Disney bought them. So it was very, very valuable and clear that Disney should buy them. They had hits like Iron Man, I believe, before Disney bought them.
I don't know the timeline, but I bet that's right.
I'm pretty certain that's right. They bought them for billions much later after they had a string of successes. Despite that, I would suspect that Disney was probably watching them anyway for their IP. But what Marvel did that was unique is that they took their IP and made it ultra successful and proved that the comic book industry could flourish in movie form. And they do long form stuff now, long form stories that span, just like in the comic books, they have crossovers in the comic books, right? Marvel was unique in the sense that they saw this vision for different phases of Marvel where they had stories that crossed over and told a much larger story. So instead of just being the A plot and B plot in a movie, there's the A plot, B plot, and then there's the overarching multi-year, multi-movie plot.
Living mythology.
It's pretty interesting what they did, and I think that's what made them succeed, is that they proved that there was storytelling on this much grander scale, and that's what keeps people within Marvel, because they like the universe. The reason they call it the Marvel universe and the DC universe is it is stories within that world that interconnect. To contrast that with DC, which didn't do as good of a job, they have epic characters, just the same.
If we're talking about who has first and second place, it's DC.
Right, but they didn't do as good of a job realizing that potential early on. I don't even know if they've been bought.
Yeah, it is.
There's no studio. They never started a studio. They licensed their IP.
Oh, okay. So different on paper, but yeah.
Yeah, Marvel started a studio. Anyway, that's the difference between the two in terms of success. But I wonder, at that inflection point, what happened to comics? Did we see an uptick in the sale of comics once the movies were started? We didn't?
No, not really. No, not at all.
You would think it would cross-promote.
You would think a lot of things, yeah. I think being a the comic book nerd from Simpsons, right?
No, I haven't watched enough, I think.
Well, I guess let me put it to you this way. If you decided you wanted to get into comic books, like remember when the Christopher Nolan Batman movie first came out? Huge success, big film, good film. you would think that might have led some people into a comic book store, right? To explore, find out about what this hobby is and all that. And what would they have found? But Bruce Wayne was dead in the comic books at the time of this giant film. And to get started in anything was like buy basically a bunch of issues of a bunch of different stuff and figure out an order of how to read it. There's a hard learning curve to get interested in the Wednesday comic cycle. That's almost true. An acquired taste.
If you go and you pick up Wolverine number whatever they're on, 175, if you go and you pick that up today and you just go, I'm interested in getting started, I'm just going to pick up a couple, you're going to be in the middle of a longer story, not know where you are, have no context whatsoever.
Yeah. You have to appreciate the idea of in media res to get into comics.
I think that's why graphic novels are more popular, if I'm not mistaken. They're grown more popular because usually a graphic novel is a total story.
Yeah.
Like in and of itself, and you're not coming in the middle.
Well, and that's actually been a problem for, I think, why comic books have become harder to get into, because the authors are looking at, this is not a criticism, it's the nature of the business. They're looking at, yes, the life cycle of this is I will put out a monthly comic book, but the goal of that is to be packaged into this graphic novel that sells to a broader audience, and the ways they do finances around it are more straightforward. The weekly floppies are kind of considered disposable. And so, as a fan of those, there are often times when I'll feel slighted because I'm like, oh, this isn't like a real comic. This is a graphic novel you've just divided into 6 pieces. Like, there's no logical split here. You should have given me this all at once.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's, the origins of graphic novels, if I'm not mistaken, going way back when I worked at a comic shop when I was 13. I got paid in comics.
Nice.
Sometimes they'll take the best of a series, like, hey, there were 6 episodes in here, releases in here, 6 issues that really told a good story. We're going to turn that into a graphic novel. And then in other instances, they just told a story as a graphic novel, but they first released them as individuals. And then they sold them as a group later. They still do that. I think those are more accessible generally to broaden the market, but do you know if that's worked? I think what you're saying is it really just the comic book industry hasn't sold more issues or more graphic novels as a result of the comic explosion.
All right. Well, so in general, I'm confident the answer is no, but it's complex once you get to looking at it because there's a couple of things in play. The weekly Wednesday numbers, I have some access to. They're publicly published, and I look at stuff like that just out of curiosity. And that's sort of like the people who want to mainline comic books, like the real geeks, they do that cycle. For the rest of the culture, there's a delay period where stuff goes into graphic novel format, and now it's not necessarily tracked in the same ways. Suddenly it becomes a more legitimate ISBN book. It's not the diamond numbers, which are also there are reasons to question the legitimacy of those in terms of they do different weird things to boost those numbers. But you're dealing now with different systems, and it's really hard to count. Digital comics have become a thing in the last 20 or so years. And the general sentiment of people who look at the data deeper than I do is that digital comics have not so much cannibalized the, weekly printed comic business, maybe a little bit, but mostly they've brought new users into it.
Oh, well, that's good. I never thought about the digital side. So now we were talking about technology and how it's going to affect sales.
Right.
I'd be curious how the digital, over the last 10 years has affected sales. Of course, it would cannibalize the weeklies.
Well, not necessarily. Like me personally, my experience, and I don't do this anymore, I stopped during COVID, but for a long time, I was a guy who went every Wednesday, and part of why I enjoyed comics was that experience. I got to know the shop owner, there were regulars I'd bump into, we talk a little bit, behind the scenes stuff people knew, and it was a bigger experience than just buying media. But without that, I'm less incentivized to be on the weekly schedule.
Good point. I could see that. There were people who would just hang out in the comic shop.
Yeah.
And talk with the owners and browse, and they would just looking for a new story. They'd say, hey, what's good now? And then the whole conversation would ensue. Technology, moving back to our central question, knowing what we've discussed in the state and that the industry isn't really increasing sales, not at least not in a dramatic way. If it's increasing at all, it might be through digital, but we can't confirm that 100%. So,
although we should say it increases Halo revenue. You know, they might not be selling more X-Men comics, but they're certainly selling a hell of a lot more X-Men T-shirts.
Yep, all the ancillary stuff, the X-Men characters, the X-Men T-shirts. That's why Marvel's so valuable, right?
Sure.
Could I see a future where the comic book industry loses sales to new technology? And I listed off two. Either way, let's break down VR and gaming.
Sure.
Gaming has been around for a long time already. And it is, at this point, more revenue generating than the film and television industry, last I recall, on the numbers.
For sure.
I think it's somewhere 80, 90, 100 billion in revenue, but it's probably more. We have the numbers on that. Since gaming has really taken off in the last 20 years, we can't tell how much of gaming contributed to, you know, the decline of the comic book industry or the leveling off of the comic book industry. It's staying flat. But it's clear that gaming hasn't shut it down.
Right.
VR is something that is so different, and if we get to a point in the future where it's utterly immersive and you can be the character and live the experience in a more real way, that to me is the comic book of the future, which will bring in new people. But I think that the comic book industry, as I think about it, has hit a leveling off, and the diehards are going to be the diehards. 100,000 comics sold nationally or internationally is not that much.
I mean,
right? Is that nationally or internationally? 100,000.
I think there's very little international market. It's probably 10% on top of whatever. So, yeah, I mean, if you sell 100,000 comic books, you're a legend.
The people who are buying comics now, there will be new people who buy comics in the future that just like, for whatever reason, they read them with their dad. There's a nostalgia to it. They still like touching paper. They like the smell of the new comic. Just like there's people right now, the audio book and digital reading has not destroyed the paperback book industry.
Right. And against all odds, young people get into jazz.
Yeah, exactly. So there will be a market for it, but it's not. I don't see it growing. I don't really see it going away or shrinking dramatically in the advent of something like fully immersive VR.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, they're different experiences. I mean, maybe the market share of how people choose to execute on their leisure time may shift, but sequential art as a storytelling mechanism has some unique qualities that are unmatched anywhere else.
I do think that if you could marry a tech company that does VR with the comic book company that writes the stories, and you could release a version that is more immersive, it would be kind of cool.
Dude, that sounds like a disaster to me. I do not want to watch that.
No, not watch it, but sort of
or like experience it, whatever we call it.
Experience it. You know, can you imagine how unusual the characters would look in a VR situation, because they're all drawn so wildly, like
that's
disproportionate and.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, like, early adoption stuff I've started to shy away from. Like, the first VR comic book thing is going to be a terrible proof of concept. And that's fine. Like, I'm glad somebody is working it out. Will it get there? I don't know. But yeah, there are things that are endemic and true of comic books that don't translate. Like, if you look at, like, a lot of the art, they have muscles that don't exist anatomically. You know, like
Todd McFarlane, man. Woo!
Right.
He was always wild.
That's part of the style and the format in a way, and that doesn't translate, or at least not in a way that I'm aware of.
Well, maybe it would if there was a VR version of it. Even just the first step of reading a comic book in a fully, not necessarily VR, but with goggles on, where the whole screen is taken up and you're just reading it. I'm surprised. I mean, that's probably been done. There's probably viewers for that, but it doesn't sound enticing to me.
I agree. There's been a fair amount of this digital comic stuff. In fact, there's a famous author, Mark Waid, who I think started a new company that was all about this. And I checked out one of the things he did, and it was cool. You could tell they were trying things, to the proof of concept angle on this. But I walked away from it saying, there was nothing novel here in that experience that brought me something I couldn't have experienced in the typical thing I go for, which is pick up a floppy comic and read it.
And that may just be how we came up, but like I've said about people getting used to micro bills, like you pay $6 for this, $12 for that, $1 for this, and there's just these recurring charges. People are getting used to that, which is why I think that society, as it becomes more comfortable, will move towards like these micro payments on things or for a service more and more.
I hope so.
Yeah, and I hope so too. So my point here is that people become more comfortable with it. That's why the cable industry is dying, because people are comfortable with a la carte now, and it's going to keep going that way. But that comfort is the thing that I'm curious about. Imagine a kid coming up today who the first video game experience they have is with VR, and it's good. They're probably going to be, by the time they're 10, so comfortable with the idea of VR that it would feel odd reading a comic book outside of VR, or odd doing something that they've done in VR outside of VR, because it's just our perception of how we came up versus theirs.
Well, what if they learned chess entirely in VR? Do you think they would be uninterested in playing a real chessboard?
I suspect the experience, like you said, the experience is different, but I'd be curious to know what the real key differentiators between VR and reality are, and where the difference gap is, because right now obviously VR, it's not reality and it's still otherworldly, and you're not physically touching anything, so there's a big difference there. It is only visual and auditory at this point.
Yeah, well, even as we look at the asymptote of that, the visual can get better, but just the nature of it can't be like the holodeck in Star Trek. That's a fantasy.
I mean, we project out far enough. Is it? I don't know. But right now,
as soon as I need to touch things, like, well, where did the thing come from? And, Well,
yeah, I mean, they're experimenting with that, certainly, with gloves that you wear that stimulate.
Yeah, there'll be some stuff, but there's a limit there. Whereas vision, I mean, the technology that humans can create today exceeds the resolution of the human eye. So I'll give you anything you want on the vision side of it. Even smell, I believe we could come up with some chemical system where you release smells. But touch, I don't know.
I mean, of course you don't know, but right now, 100, 150 years, 80 years, it's a different story, because if the moment we get brain-computer interface of some degree, or we can stimulate certain areas in the brain to create sensations, then as we learn more about the brain and as it becomes closer to being able to, tell what regions of the brain to fire, then maybe that's hopeful that we could do something where you could feel something. Because I don't think that, like you said, I don't think simulating it by wearing a glove or a full bodysuit, that's just not going to work. So yeah, I just don't see a future in which VR is doing that until we have a very thorough and complete understanding of the human brain and have a brain-computer interface. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, on like the 1,000-year scale of the engineering of this, I think it's more likely that we don't have gloves, we have USB ports in the back of our neck.
100%, yes. That's what I'm saying.
And that, once I plug that in, I mean, there's a lot of weird safety, ethical questions around that, but like I plug in that and have an experience, sure, I'll buy that. Yeah, because then you've directly overridden my sensor network.
Imagine the security concerns of that USB in the back of your head. Oh, it better not be USB. Jesus. It better be something faster than USB. Oh, it's lightning. Okay, lightning connectors.
Something more reliable, hopefully.
In that future, I think comic books go away. I don't think we'll have anything.
I disagree completely.
That's 1,000 years from now, or we're 500 years from now.
Are paintings going to go away?
I think a lot of that stuff will go away, honestly, as people become more and more accustomed. And we're projecting out really far now as we become more accustomed to the digital realm, and the digital realm becomes more real and we get brain-computer interfaces. Yeah, I think that stuff will go away.
Well, I guess there's one discussion I would side table because I think it's distraction of, and that is there a point where we just download experiences? Like rather than going skiing or, whatever, you just download and experience someone else's skiing thing. Like that's a whole weird conversation. Outside of that, like there's still, sure, do people listen to radio dramas less once TV came out? Yeah, but there's still a community of people that do that and stuff like that. And I think there are unique properties of the medium of comic book storytelling that people will always appreciate in the same way paintings have not gone out of fashion after photography.
We have to bucket it in time ranges, right?
Yeah.
I think that's always the conversation. In the near term, I agree, but look at today. There are still Model T enthusiasts who probably put them back together, but they're far and few between, and almost no one wants to do it.
But you're thinking that a modern car is a direct improvement over the Model T, which I agree. I don't think a VR game is a direct improvement over what Stan and Jack did in the 60s.
Right now you don't, but the kid 50 years from now probably will. And because they're used to the digital domain. And imagine a world, like you said, where we're downloading an experience. Well, forget about downloading an experience. What about downloading a comic and sort of experiencing it along as you read it, or the emotions are sort of, you can feel it a little bit more. Even if it's just subtle, like you're reading it and you get this, oh my, the character feels this, and you can program it into the story, right? The emotion into the story, and it's jacked into your brain. Once you can stimulate the brain and you know how to map it, then all bets are off. And I do think that experience will be more immersive for 99.9% of people in a long enough timeline. Not right now, because there will be the old curmudgeons. And then there'll be the people who, for whatever reason, love to adopt old technologies or love, landlines or rotary phones, and there's always going to be those people who harken back to that time.
Let's build a trebuchet, right?
Right, yeah. Right. But it'll still be far and few between, and I think at that point, it won't be worth it publishing. It'll be a collector thing, right? There just won't be enough money in that far-flung future where there's a whole publishing company around it. Like they'll be reading old ones and there'll be tributes online, people writing them, and the technology becomes so easy, like you said. Oh, that was the second technology.
Right.
Auto generation.
Yeah, let's get into this.
I think what you were saying is that AI, which we've shown, can auto generate drawings really well. Mm-hmm. I think people would be surprised at how well. Shockingly well, in fact.
Yes.
Like real world looking. It's impressive. And then possibly auto-generate stories, because they do auto-generate news articles and stories right now that are really compelling. And
right.
Did you see the Sam Harris one where somebody trained an AI to mimic Sam Harris?
I did not.
Yeah, you have to look that one up. It's hilarious.
Sure. Without a doubt, there's an interface you can type in words and hear him speak them in an artificial way. That technology is there to do that today.
Right. So given the state of technology, do I see a future or near future? Let's first talk near. Do I see a near future where those people comic book authors are replaced by automation?
Well, we've got to break out who the creators are. So there's typically, and maybe I'm sure you know this, but for background for listeners, you will have whoever's credited as writer has generally written not only the words, but come up with the story and, some description of what happens. And then there's an artist who kind of follows the instructions of the writer. And now that pairing can be different. There's collaborators who work at it in different ways, but the general model is the writer does all the story points and character stuff. The artist turns those words, that vision, that script into the images. And then perhaps there are other professionals, such as a colorist or an inker, or even the letterer, who will come back and do their work. But lettering in particular has basically ended, and inking as a profession is starting to end. So we are seeing automation creeping in already to comic book creation, but not necessarily yet to the writer or the artist.
All right. So in that, my hot take on the idea of whether or not AI can replace the writer and the artist is, in the near term, no. In a longer term, yes, I think a lot of things are going to go away, not just comic books. I think you will have AIs that write romance novels because they're cheap and easy, and they churn them out and they cost next to nothing. And it could be an AI author and nobody knows it, but people love it and it hits. I could see that happening. Not yet, but the same goes for comics. I think there will be humans, but there will be a transitionary period where AI is used to tell stories, and there will be some success there. Then there will be the diehards who say, I don't want no AI drivel. I want a human who wrote it. And that's the future, I think, that is a little further off. But in the near term, no. What is your hot take?
It depends on what we mean. Will there be people publishing products that are fully or, significantly automated? Yes, especially in comics, because there's been a long history of random little startups trying to get going and taking shortcuts. There was one for a while that was publishing, I think it was called Blue Water. I don't know if they're still around. They would basically make a comic book of a Wikipedia page of a famous person. Like, here are the big points in Joe Biden's life, and it would be a 30-page...
Automated?
Not automated, but like what I suspect they were doing is they went on sites like Upwork and hired overseas artists at rock bottom, $10 an hour prices, and just said, draw a little picture of Joe Biden at a conference and do this and do that, and copy and paste this sort of weird Frankenstein creation together. And those were around, and I looked at them, and it felt like a weird, like, kind of half-hearted attempt to create something to me as a consumer, but they sold for a while. So I think the ability to quickly release something, especially like an ebook on Amazon, there's so much digital pollution of ebooks. We'll see that continue, but that's just, a long tail of stuff. That's not saying the next issue of Batman was written by an AI.
Right, but that's how it begins, right? It begins in the long tail, and then it becomes more acceptable, and they refine it, and it gets better. So in the near term, you agree. There won't be a replacement, and there will be attempts and things that come out with AI, but it won't be, obviously, Batman.
Yeah, well, here's one thing that'll happen. One of the two comic companies, for PR and sensationalism benefits, will do an issue that was AI-generated art. Because actually, the technology is there with style transfer, GANs and stuff like that. You could say, give me a picture of original Hal Jordan Green Lantern as drawn by Frank Quitely, the artist, in his style. And
could you do that for Kyle? Kyle Higgins.
The technology is there. For me to help him do a little like fun POC would be a pretty big time investment, making it prohibitive for just a cute fun thing. I wish I could. It's not unrealistic, and that's the kind of thing where he should check in with me in 2 or 3 years.
At this point, we agree in the near term, again, that there's not a wholesale replacement.
For sure.
Right?
Maybe some tooling, like, the artist can work faster because they have this, Predicto brush, but replacement, no.
Or it could be that the artist says, hey, give me the general sketch in my style of this.
Yeah.
And it starts with a general sketch, and it's digital.
Right.
So it can adjust it later.
Yeah. Or do the backgrounds for me. Or draw the horses.
In my style, because it will have learned this artist's style, right? I imagine that if you fed all of Rob Liefeld or Todd McFarlane's work, you could have the AIs could generate something like that now.
Absolutely. Yeah. It would be a project. One would have to invest effort in it. But it is like doing a big IKEA installation. You just follow the standard known path, and you can do that.
So we agree. Near term, not going to happen. Tooling will likely happen. PR stunts will likely happen with AI. But that's in the near term. Now, let's talk farther out. I don't want to put a number of years on it, but a future in which AI could do the work and could tell actual stories really well.
That I don't know about, because that assumes that the creative spark is something that can be commoditized. So think of this. Is there in our future an AI that can write funny jokes? Probably. Is there a super powerful AI that can write jokes so rapidly and so hilarious that any audience convulses over an unstoppable laughter?
Likely no, because it's also dependent upon the audience. Like if you went through the volume of data, I love Bill Burr, and I listen to Bill Burr, and he's even said you could go to one city and the jokes are all hitting, and then the next city and they're not. So let's say AI had access to all of Bill Burr's history of jokes. One joke works one place, not another. I'm not sure it would have a consistent data set to know, okay, that type of joke works. And then it would have to take into account the history of the room and how primed they are for jokes. Right? Is the room, did the last 5 jokes hit? Because some jokes work better if the last 5 jokes already got them laughing.
Sure.
Was the last joke a dud? So now I need a real juicy one.
Right.
So all that is so complicated. There's so much context that's missing from the AI there. So, yes, I don't think you'll have even in 150 years an AI that can nail it every single time. But humans can't either.
Correct.
So
maybe it's not our fault. Maybe we're limited by nature, just in the same way the AI will be.
Right. And so I think the benefit there is that you can churn out comic books that more frequently that have low risk and low cost and that suit the audience. You could even say, I want this one to take a darker tone. This is the dark Batman. This is the happier Batman. And, pick the one you want. And you get more stylized comic books that way, more stylized to the different personalities that might be out there.
Yeah. So if you want to produce a lot of derivative work, that's going to come into a possibility pretty quickly.
Right.
But that innovative spark that's required to get someone interested in following issue 2 after they read issue 1, that's something novel.
Do you remember that song Crazy? 'Cause I'm crazy.
Aerosmith?
Gnarls Barkley?
Oh, yeah, Gnarls Barkley.
Do you know about the algorithm that predicted that was a hit?
No, I do not, but this sounds great.
You need... I'd be shocked if you didn't know about it in some other fashion, but basically there was an algorithm. It was the first time it was really used, and they ran that song through it. And this song had been trained on a set of, hits over the last 50 years. The song came out, Gnarls Barkley's song, saying, this is a huge hit. It hits all these categories because it had groupings of hits and why they're hits. And it came out as a huge hit, and nobody believed it, of course, right? Because it's a weird song. When you first hear it, his voice is weird. I don't think anybody in the room would have said this is a hit. But the algorithm said it was a hit, and it ended up being a hit. And now apparently the music industry uses this algorithm to get a sense of where to move music if they want to make it more of a hit.
My hot take is this is nonsense.
All right, we should hot take this.
I'm going to research this. This can be the next episode. I'm going to look more into this because I have not heard of it.
My point is that if you took the history of comic books and said what's a hit, I do think if you were to train AI that way, you would get a lot of derivative work on the same topic, on certain same themes, and people would be, over time, less accustomed to reading it because it would follow similar story arcs in very similar fashions.
No AI would have invented Watchmen.
Right, exactly. So I agree with you. For general consumption, I think that on a week-to-week basis there might be some AI involved, but that creative spark, those things that change the industry are not coming from AI, not even in 100 years. I don't.
Probably not.
I don't even think so. And because...
Well, the question is, will we have AGI in 100 years? And then all bets are off. You could hire an AGI writer the same way you could a human writer.
Yes. This is a question, but that goes back to a whole nother topic on AGI. But let's assume we did have AGI. If in a future where we do have AGI, AGI implies creativity, right?
It can do anything a human can do, and maybe more.
That's the general consensus on what AGI means. Anything a human can do.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, if it can pass the Turing test, otherwise whatever it can't do is a good way to prove it fails the Turing test.
That's a tough one, but the Turing test, I'd have to go beyond the Turing test on that one. Really. Fooling us into believing it's a machine is different than creating content that moves someone.
I understand that you feel that way, but it's unclear to me why that should follow.
Well, moving someone, like moving them emotionally, like you can pass a Turing test without moving someone emotionally at all.
Correct, but that's not the measure of evidence. It's, does a system, human or otherwise, capable of passing this test, this imitation game? You're now inferring there's some other limit, which essentially the test is saying, no, that is intelligent. And anything an intelligent thing can do, another intelligent thing can do.
I'm implying this, that there's a step beyond the Turing test that would need to happen in order to convince me that a machine could generate emotive content like that, or move people, move them emotionally. I suspect without that capability, you could seem like you're just talking to, not seem like, but if you talk to the computer for 6 months, you would probably realize that this is less of a human. In the early iterations,
failing
for
the
sure.
imitation game. That would not be a passing of the Turing test.
No, but the Turing test has a time limit, doesn't it?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Pretty sure there is. There must be.
I don't think so.
How do you ever define it? When does it end? Because how much time do you need to evaluate it? What's the difference between 5 minutes and 1 hour?
When the judge is satisfied, they can make a decision.
Oh, I would just never be satisfied. Like, I would need months.
Undecidable, then.
Yeah, I would need months. I would need
Sure.
my child to come home crying to it and see how it responds.